Hello and welcome to EPR with your favorite environmental enthusiasts, Nic and Laura. On today's episode, Laura and I discuss exploring your career. We talk to Michael Smith about how cool he is, or about his time as being a photojournalist, park ranger, and environmental consultant. It's a lot of fun, really good interview, really engaging stories, so I'm sure you guys are going to enjoy it. And finally, raccoons hunt by touch more than any other sense. They have about 4 times as many sensory receptors in their front paws than their back ones, and are able to distinguish food items in the dead of night. I promise I won't make a joke about their hands, but is it weird that I kind of want to try this? Like a little bit, like, I don't know, like blindfold me and a raccoon, and then we'll see who wins, right? Like I can do this. I can tell you that's an apple, that's an orange. I'm in. I got it. No? It is weird. Okay. No. It's definitely weird.
It's definitely weird, and I don't think you would win.
You don't think so? I feel like I know what food is just by touch.
No, because remember, raccoons are mapeche.
They are cool. They have the absolute coolest name in Spanish. That is 100% correct. Well, on that awkward note, let's hit that music.
Right. NAEP is accepting submissions for the NAEP's annual conference and training symposium in Fort Lauderdale, Florida. It's going to be awesome. May 16th through 19th, this coming spring. Submit your proposals today for the session, posters, panels, and more. NAEP will be accepting the abstracts through November 15th. Sign up at www.naep.org. And NAEP is also hosting a free webinar with Esri, Designing Resilient Transportation Networks with GIS. That will be November 16th at 10 a.m. Pacific time and 1 p.m. Eastern time. Nic and I love doing the show. If you love it too, we would love you to help us keep doing it by sponsoring. Head on over to the www.environmentalprofessionalsradio.com website and check out the sponsor form for details. Now let's get to our segment.
So I was just wondering if there's anything from Michael's discussion that you would want to talk about, even if it's short.
Like career exploring, like how important it is. Because that's what I preach in my career coaching is like, you're not just going to look online or take a test or personality test or what your skills and strengths are and go, oh, that's the profession for me. You have to get out there and try stuff.
Yeah.
You might think something looks amazing on paper and you've spent $100,000 going to school. And then I see it all the time. People are coming to me going, I didn't really get the degree I wanted. This isn't what I thought it would be. Get out there and volunteer, do stuff, talk to people before you spend that money.
Yeah.
Do that,
yes.
A guidance counselor is going to go, let's take this test and see where you fit. And that's their job to get you signed up for classes. There's not their job to find out your best path because they just want you enrolled in the school.
Oh, yeah.
It's your job to take the time to volunteer and do stuff and figure out what you like and what you don't. People ask me all the time, well, can you let me know when you think there's something? I'm like, I don't know what you would like. What I like, I like, and what you like is what you like. Even if we are identical twins, we're going to be into different things, you know?
Yeah.
So I love that Michael's path was all about just
career
going
wherever the world took him. Yeah,
the interest took him.
I mean, I'm glad you said that because when I went to college, right, that's exactly what happened. Guidance counselors were like, well, you're really smart, so you should be an engineer, right? I know how to do math. Like, I can do it. I hate math. I hate it. Guess what's in every engineering class? Nothing but math. So I'm like, I don't like this. I don't want to be an engineer. I don't want anything to do with it. It's just not for me. There's some people that love that stuff, and that's great. But it took me like 2 years to figure that out. And I'm like, oh, like we talked about, my mom going, why don't you just do biology, big dummy, And,
right.
Yeah, you're totally right. And I loved hearing him say that too. And he had like great jobs, but he's like, these were fun. I really enjoyed them, but my passion showed up and I followed it, as he went from one job to the next. And that's really, really cool.
That, and regardless of like where he ended up, he has great experiences. Why bang your head against the wall trying to I need this career. This is what I'm going to do. And just hate every moment of it. Like, do some things that you really like and you'll have some nice stories to reflect on and meet some cool people probably.
And like a new door will open. It always does. It's an incredible thing about this. It's like, who would have thought? Photojournalist, park ranger, environmental consultant, right? Like, what?
Yeah.
Those are all very different jobs, completely different. That's really cool. It's really, really cool. So,
And I bet he had some other secret missions in there he didn't talk about.
Yeah. When we have him back, we'll have to ask about it.
Yeah, but let's get to it. His interview is fantastic.
Yeah, perfect. Hello and welcome back to EPR. Today we have a very special guest, Michael Smith, who is the Director of Environmental Process and Policy with WSP USA. He's also a California AEP board member, NAEP liaison, and has been an at-large board member with NAEP for several years as well. Welcome, Michael.
Hey, thanks. It's great to be here, and thank you for the invitation.
Yeah, really, really excited to have you on. I mean, I think honestly, we could spend the whole interview talking about all of the cool stuff you've done over your career. but yeah, let's start with your current role. What do you do?
Yeah, so at WSP, we have a lot of people who do environmental planning, environmental impact assessment, kind of across a number of different divisions. Some people focus in particular sectors like transportation or energy. But I'm in a small group, kind of a specialized group that we name ourselves Environmental Process and Policy. And it's part of our advisory services practice. So it's kind of focused, and it's actually aligned with the management consultancy part of our company. So it's kind of interesting. So we provide kind of high-level strategic advice, particularly on larger, more complex projects, programs. And we have a big focus, and we have several people in the group who have either worked at CEQ or worked with the Department of Transportation over the years, particularly in the Obama administration, when there was an effort on streamlining, and I know that can be a bad word to some people in NEPA, but maybe we'll say improving the efficiency of
there we go.
not only NEPA, but the environmental permitting process, but without hopefully compromising quality and compliance, which we might say might have been different in an unnamed later administration that came along, maybe in some ways. So we focus on helping our own staff as well as clients, which can be federal agencies, sometimes even state agencies, local governments that get wrapped into the NEPA process, and then also private sector clients as well. Again, it's helping to navigate, which of course we all do for all of us who are consultants, better through the environmental review and permitting process. But again, our focus tends to often be on very large, very complex projects that have, just so many different pieces and challenges to them. So it's a great place to be. We get to work, and I get to work on so many just really cool and groundbreaking and fascinating projects. That's fun.
Yeah, for sure. And we'll definitely dive into some of those as we go through. So like when you're doing like your analysis, your support here, you're teaching project managers how to comply with what's going on with NEPA. Is that at the beginning of a project process? Are you there the whole time as a consultant because those large projects, I'm assuming you've got to be involved beginning, middle, end.
Yeah, that's a great question. And it does vary, but to your point, you're exactly right. It's best when we do get involved early, but sometimes for various reasons we don't. And then you're kind of coming in partway through the process. And that can be difficult, obviously, to steer a train back on the tracks or however you want to say it. But sometimes when we do get the opportunity, which we often do at the start and through scoping and even pre-scoping and internal conversations that an agency or an applicant might be having about just kind of the strategy for navigation, oftentimes we will follow that all the way through the process to the kind of the bitter end and, a NEPA decision document. And a lot of projects that we do work with are at the EIS level, not all of them, but many of them are larger programmatic environmental impact statements.
Yeah, it's just really, really great answer. I love that.
It's exciting work.
Yeah, it really is. And like, you have quite a career. So I don't know, Laura, you want to dive into these questions here? They're pretty fun.
I do. I also, could talk strategy and continuous improvement and business advisory all day long. Love those words. But we want to help our younger listeners and our listeners who are trying to change careers, learn a little bit about our environmental professionals and NAEP members and how they got where they are. And looking at your history, there's just a ton of questions about how you got where you are, but some of the previous work that you've done. And I made my first visit to Glacier National Park last year during the pandemic, and it was so amazing. So when I saw that you actually had worked there before as a park ranger, totally envious, but also just curious, how did you get that job? And why did you leave that job?
Yeah, that's a good question. Well, of course, there's a long backstory, but I'll give you the very short version. I actually started working in national parks, first in Yosemite National Park, and I was going to college in California, undergraduate college at the University of California in Santa Cruz. And I had shifted over from kind of a prior career and interest in journalism to environmental policy. And as part of that, I saw an announcement for an internship program actually at Yosemite to work with the park rangers and the staff there through a program they had within the Park Service within the park. And so I did that for one summer between my years in college, and I loved it. And so I was like, I want to, now I want to go do this for real. And maybe to part of your question, I found out then, the people love me in the park, and they were like, yeah, we'd love to hire you, but there's probably a very low probability that we will, because it's this incredibly onerous application process. And, there are veteran preference points that often kind of skew the system. And so it's tough. And so I applied to Yosemite, and that was on the top of my list. I wanted to go there. I grew up in the Bay Area and spent a lot of my childhood there. And then also even in the Central Valley, closer to Yosemite for high school. But at the time, you could apply for 2 parks for a summer ranger. As a naturalist, that's what I wanted to do and what I had done before. And so I didn't know where really else to apply. I had actually spent very little time at that point in my life outside of California. And I thought about the other California parks, but, it's like, I want maybe the other one, I'll just do something really kind of wild. I'd always wanted to go to Alaska. I'd never been. So I was like, okay, maybe Denali. And then I was having a conversation with somebody, actually one of my professors at Santa Cruz, and they started talking about Glacier National Park, and they have this lifelong love and huge mountains. And I was like, okay, that's where I'm going to apply. So I applied, and miracle of miracles, I got the job. And then I spent 3 summers at Glacier while in college, both undergraduate and then when I went on to graduate school. And also, to your point, Laura, best job I've ever had. Believe it or not, even more than, spreadsheets for costing on a proposal for an EIS. I know it's shocking.
Stunning, yeah.
To my job to be to take people out on hikes, all day hikes for 8 hours and see glaciers and grizzly bears and all that kind of stuff. But it was wonderful, but it was a seasonal job. And I knew a lot of people who were trying to make the route into permanent jobs with the National Park Service. And it's tough. And you often have to go to a not so desirable park unit. And there were jokes about places like and not to offend anybody from St. Louis, but the Gateway Arch was one, or in Lower Manhattan, one of the historic parks there. And I was kind of really getting into policy at that point. I wanted to go to graduate school, and then eventually that led to some other things. So that's the short version of how I ended up in one of my favorite places on earth.
Awesome. Do you have like 1 or 2 quick stories to share from that time?
Sure. Yeah. There were a lot of bears there, and coming from California, where we don't have any grizzly bears, at least anymore. We have one on the state flag, but the last one was killed here, unfortunately, in 1923, I think was the year. Unfortunately, there were thousands of them. I mean, they went from the Pacific Ocean on the beaches, in San Francisco, right in San Francisco, and then all over the state and the valley and up in the mountains. But unfortunately, they were removed, I think partly because obviously of the danger. But, Glacier, as you know, and you went there, Laura, it's one of those few places where we still have them, in a place big enough, wild enough, protected enough. And Glacier has a very healthy population, probably in size, second only to Yellowstone and the greater Yellowstone ecosystem to the south. And that really was a game changer in terms of just being there, including in the housing I lived in. And the valley I lived in was on the east side of the park, and it was actually a major bear freeway and maybe intersection. There were 5 valleys that all came together. So, you were told like at night, have a flashlight, maybe make some noise, be really careful. But then going out on the trails, and we would see them very frequently, and, you had to make noise. I mean, at least if you didn't want to have a bear encounter. And so yelling or singing, or, some people use bells, although a lot of people kind of, exactly. But the bells, they always had the jokes about the bells that, what happens to the hiker with the bells and the bear, and, you find it in the bear scat, the bells, and things like that. But yelling, and I'm not really much of a singer, at least anybody who I'd be hiking with would want to see, and I might even anger the bear. So I would yell. The hay bear. And it was just so weird, right, to be in this wild landscape of solitude and have to yell all the time. and I had the kind of this inside knowledge. I mean, we had training, our orientation training. My first summer, I remember this, like this 2-week crash course, right? And everything about the bears, and all the resource specialists and the scientists in the park would come in and give presentations on, mountain goat biology and grizzly bears and all the species and hydrology and fish. I mean, it was absolutely amazing. It was like better than college. But the bear management, who the rangers head of bear management, came in and like gave a history of all of the bear attacks in the park, and there had been a lot, and and with details and photographs, and so we kind of like right away I'm like, okay, this is going to be different, and I feel very lucky. In my 4 summers there, I never had a troubling encounter. I did encounter many bears. And, one funny story, I had a group of 50 people that I was taking on a hike in this beautiful part of the park. You may have gone there, called the Mini Glacier Valley. And we would take people on these boats on these beautiful lakes and then take them on a pretty short hike. And so you get a lot of kids and a lot of senior citizens, because it was a flat trail, not very long, because some of the trails in Glacier are quite steep and rigorous, as you probably experienced. So anyways, we're on this hike. I've got at least 50 people strung behind me. And up ahead, I hear somebody yell, "Bear, bear." And I look, and here's a very large mother. I knew it was a mother in a second, because it was a bear coming at me, and then 2 cubs right behind it. Oof. And I turned around and I yelled to everybody. I was like, "Get off the trail!" And and the funniest part of the story, I think, is there was another ranger, actually a bear management ranger, on a trail that was about 500 feet above me and saw the whole thing. And so I didn't even really know what happened, but he recounted it to me, and he called it he still calls it today. I ran into him in the park when I went back about 5 years ago. He says, "Oh, you're the parting of the waters ranger," because literally the bear and the cubs went down the trail and people just scattered to the side, and no one got injured or encountered the bear. They just, all 3 of them, the mother and 2 cubs, just ran through everybody and just went on their merry way. But I have to say, it was incredible just to be in their presence. And once I learned that they really weren't like, waiting behind every tree to jump out and get you, that they really just wanted to leave you alone. Mm-hmm. And it was really scaring them, or startling them. Surprising them is really the problem. And so you make noise. And I never had an encounter. And unfortunately, some people did. And I was involved in helping a number of visitors be medevaced out, who were, in some cases, very severely injured by bears, including actually after I left the park. I think 2 summers later, a ranger I knew very well was actually attacked in the fall, which was typically the most dangerous time, because they're out, they're nervous, they're stressed, because they want to eat as much as they can before they go into hibernation. But anyway, that's one bear story for you.
Wow, well that's so fascinating. It's so cool to talk to someone who's actually had this experience, because I think a lot of us just kind of dream about it.
Yeah.
Yeah, it was incredible. They're incredible creatures. I have enormous respect. One summer we had, this is not a story, but quickly, we had a mother who had 4 cubs, which happens very, very rarely. Even 3 is pretty rare. 1 or 2 are much more common. And we could spend the whole summer. We had one ranger program where each of us, there were 7 of us. So one day a week, you'd have like a 3-hour program. You'd set up a very powerful telescope in a parking lot of a little motor in there in that valley. And the bear and the cubs were almost always in like 3 different locations. So you could just go out and immediately set up, and if they're not there, they're over there. Oh man, visitors just love, and the cubs were so playful when there was snow early in the season. And, bears, just like, they're just so both smart but playful. They would literally, the cubs would walk up, the mother would lead them, walk up to the top of a snowbank, and then they'd all slide down. And then just keep doing it over and over again. And they just looked like they were having the greatest time in the world. So, yes.
That's incredible.
Oh, such great experiences. But then I have to ask, you were a photojournalist before this experience. So did you take a lot of pictures during your time?
I did, actually. Yeah, that's a great question. And I did have, like probably a lot of people. And, it's funny, over the years, both working with colleagues and at conferences, but also with some of the NEPA training that I do, I've asked a lot of people, like, how did you get into doing NEPA environmental, review permitting work? And so many people seem to say, and I think this is true for some of your podcast guests that I've listened to, kind of by accident,
right.
And that was kind of true for me, including, starting kind of coming right out of high school, actually, into the start of a career as first a photojournalist and then eventually a newspaper writer as well. And I did that for several years down in the San Joaquin Valley when I was down there for a couple different, one a weekly paper and then eventually the big daily paper in the city south of Fresno that I lived in. And it was really amazing. And I really thought that that was what I was going to do. But at Santa Cruz, my intention, I had decided I wasn't going to get a journalism degree because I had a number of mentors say, even if you want to be a journalist, don't get the technical journalism degree, specialize in something, some kind of topical area. And I had taken this, right around that time, I took this college class with a professor, and this is kind of, ironic, maybe the wrong word, but there was a big fire in Sequoia National Park this summer, just a little over a month ago. I think it's now out with some snow, but you may have seen the images, threatened some of the largest tree in the world, the General Sherman tree and these sequoias. And he had done his PhD research on some of the very first science and studies leading to recommendations to do controlled burning in sequoia groves. And his work that he started actually led to eventually that fire having very little effect on those main groves because they had been doing this controlled and prescribed burning program for decades, really. But anyways, he had us read books like Sand County Almanac and even I think some Wallace Stegner and Barry Lopez and some of these kind of key environmental writers. And I just got hooked on it. And so I decided I'm going to major in environmental policy for my undergrad, which I eventually did. And then somewhere along the way, as that was happening, and maybe when I started rangering, somehow the journalism just kind of fell away. And I just got more interested in environmental policy in graduate school. And eventually that led to other things that brings me here today.
Yeah. That's amazing. And that is just a true testament to just follow your passions. They'll take you, whether it's through photography or something else, to where you're meant to be. And I didn't know we shared that. My first love was photography. My first 2 years of college were photography and design. So that's really awesome.
Yeah, and on that note about, following not only your passion, but, I think you end up with now when I look back, these decision points in your life, even if you don't know that they're happening at the time. I actually got a job right out of high school working for this new 3-time-a-week paper. And it just started up from actually a disgruntled employee who had gotten fired from the main paper in town. And he and another high school colleague of mine, we had just graduated. It was the summer that we graduated high school before going on to college. And he let us do anything. We got to be, experienced reporters because there were no other reporters or photographers for that matter. And he would just be like, well, just think of stories. And, so I was, here I am like 18, 19 years old. I'm like, I've never flown in a helicopter. So I'm going to call up the highway patrol in Fresno and say, I want to do a story on your helicopter and all of the great things you do. And, so sure enough, come on down. And we go up and they fly me. And it turns out there was like these armed people on a freeway down in the valley, and we landed while I was with them. And they landed the helicopter, they drew their guns, and it was like a Hollywood movie, like The Rock was telling me, like, stay in the helicopter. Right. Don't go out. We got this,
Right.
I'm like, oh, come on, Rock, I can help out.
Yeah, you don't know.
But I did, and they ran out and apprehended this person. I mean, it was nuts. And then another time I was like, I'd never flown in a small airplane. So then I called up the sheriff's office and they had an airplane and I went up with them and, just crazy stuff like that. And I got to cover wildfires. I get to go to the landing out in the desert at Edwards Air Force Base for the space shuttle, the first one that came back after the Challenger accident, right? And
wow.
I think which was in 86.
Yeah.
And there was a year or two delay in the program. Well, they figured out, of course, what went wrong. And so it was a huge deal. And, out in the desert and all these giant booths were erected out where they land the shuttle, and all the main news anchors at the time were there, Dan Rather and Tom Brokaw and all those people. And it was just super exciting. It was just amazing to see this little dot, and then you hear these sonic booms, and then the thing looks like it's falling out of the sky. Yeah. And you think it's just going to land on the desert hardpan and just blow up because it's just like dropping so fast. And then just amazingly, the last second it glides in and they land. Anyway, so it's just, it was amazing experiences. And that, in a lot of ways, that was the hard part to leave that particular career. But I've got to have a lot of other good experiences too. So, but I made that decision. Oh, but the point of that, was really quickly, one day while working at that paper in this amazing job that I should not have had as a 19-year-old, the photo editor for the real paper, the daily paper in town, contacted me and said, hey, we have an opening for a photo lab technician. You want to come work for us? And I just remember being so torn because it was way, lower step of a job. But the photo editor was like this, I mean, really a world-renowned photojournalist and one of the best sports photographers on earth. And our paper was owned by Gannett. And so he would go do assignments for USA Today. He'd cover the Olympics every 4 years or 2 years, winter and summer, and the Super Bowl. And he would, I knew it would be amazing to go work for him. And I remember talking to my mom and just struggling, like, what should I do? And then finally, my mom was like, you should go work for that guy, even if it's a lower job. And I did, and quickly turned into a photojournalist and, photographer on the staff, and then a writer. And even though I don't do that today, so much of what I do, and he really helped me out with my photography skills as well, because he really was just, and he eventually moved down to Los Angeles and became a staff photographer for USA Today. And for like 20 years, all of the Hollywood star portraits were done by him, and all the big sporting events. He was Robert Hanashiro. He was an amazing, amazing mentor. But the hardest boss I've ever worked for, if any of you have the experience, someone who really never gives you praise, but you learn you're doing okay if they're not yelling at you and mad, that like all is well, because he was such a perfectionist. He had such high standards. So that was a little challenging, but of course I just learned so much. So
that's great. And then we'll switch gears a little bit, because there's something I wanted to ask you about, because we have not surprisingly had a conversation on the show yet about this topic. So, which is the environmental impacts of legalizing marijuana. So I was wondering what the current laws are in California, because, we're both over here on the East Coast, so a little bit removed. And then are you involved in any of those types of projects?
Yeah, no, thanks for asking. Yeah, I'm not now, but I was several years ago. And some folks may know, California, I think this goes back 10 years or more, was the first state to legalize medical cannabis or marijuana, whatever you want to call it. And that was in place for several years. But then there was a movement to legalize commercial cannabis cultivation as well as selling. And we weren't the first state to do that. I think Colorado, if I remember right, may have been. But that triggered, a lot of people may know that California is one of about 20 states that has a state kind of baby NEPA, little NEPAs are often called, our law CEQA, California Environmental Quality Act. So this was not a NEPA project, but it definitely did trigger a very extensive, essentially very similar to a NEPA EIS, except they're called EIRs, Environmental Impact Reports in California. And I worked on the one that was programmatic for really cultivating, growing, and then transporting commercial cannabis statewide. So it was an incredible project to work on and very challenging. And I led the analysis in the team for greenhouse gas emissions and climate change, which, you might think upon first blush, like, are we talking about the emissions from somebody smoking, which we actually didn't look at. But it turns out that especially growing cannabis indoors has a tremendous amount of energy usage and electricity usage, and not just for lighting, but for, as I learned, ventilation and carbon dioxide, pumping it in, which helps plants grow a lot faster. And we got to go with the state. By the way, I was blown away because, people were still illegally growing at the time we were working on this, right, to legalize it. And the state would reach out, our client, the state agency, which was the agriculture agency, and they would just ask these growers, we're trying to learn more as we put this, both the policy together, but also the environmental document. And we'd like to come visit your operation. And some of these are up where I used to live for a while when I taught up at Humboldt State University in Northwestern California, up in the Emerald Triangle, as it's called, in Humboldt, Mendocino, Trinity counties up there. And, a place where, like, when I first moved there, people told me, like, stay on trails, don't go off. If you see tripwires, probably turn around is a good idea. And, there's just a lot of people defending with firearms and other things. So I was amazed that people were like, yeah, come on out, we'll give you the tour. And so we just saw the most amazing, and people were so open and frank. And some of them let us take pictures in these enormous grow operations. I remember one outdoors up there, and then another one out in the desert in Southern California that, they had just hired like some guy who'd been like in the management team and the C-suite at Pepsi and was, organizing. They wanted to sell like the most high-end cannabis was kind of their business model. And they had all these scientists figuring out, the optimal level of oxygen and carbon dioxide and lighting and all this stuff in these enormous warehouses that they had constructed out this kind of in the Palm Springs area out of the desert. And they were tapping into wind power because there's an enormous set of wind turbines out there as you drive out to Palm Springs from Los Angeles. Anyways, yeah, it was crazy. And it was just absolutely fascinating to work on. Public meetings were interesting. We had them all over the state. And, sometimes people, and they were set up like informational booths. So I had one on my impact topic for climate change, and people would come by. And then sometimes you'd chat with them for a while, and then they'd walk away, and there'd be this lingering odor. I'll let you kind of think about what that might be. And then the meetings were heavily police patrol. We would have armed, California Highway Patrol and sheriff's officers at the door. And I never was quite sure exactly what the expectation of violence was or issues, but fortunately we never had any. But yeah, it was very different than any project that I've ever worked on, both from from all of that kind of craziness, but also just from the analytical challenge of the issue. And one of the issues was, how do you do a full-blown environmental impact analysis when a lot of the people, despite what I said about some that invited us, that was a very small percentage, you didn't have data on what was going on, your baseline, your affected environment, because of course people were doing mostly that illegally and had no interest in sharing with you what they were doing. And so, again, like trying to calculate emissions, what's the baseline for instance, people using the power grid or diesel generators in outdoor grow or remote grow operations. So that was a kind of an interesting aspect of the project analytically as well.
Yeah, it's fascinating.
Yeah. And I mean, I love that no question I can ask you after this is going to be nearly as interesting. So you say that doing NEPA where you don't have all the information, how do you actually do that? How do you manage that?
Well, that's a great question. And it turned out that there was one researcher at the Lawrence Livermore Laboratory, which is in the East Bay, San Francisco Bay Area. It's a Department of Energy lab run in conjunction with the University of California, Berkeley. And this person was like an electric usage expert and worked on things like trying to improve the efficiency of the transmission grid and all of that. But he had this personal interest in what was going on with cannabis and particularly its energy usage. So he actually both got some information, interviewed some people who would talk to him, but then also went to the utilities throughout the state. And it turns out that you can find some interesting data, and law enforcement have been involved in some cases when, like, why is this house out in the middle of nowhere, using more power than a Costco? And so he basically then just kind of created a model to estimate. And we definitely did not have an exact number. And it was also interesting on the economics of it all as well. And there was a team at the University of California in Davis, led by one of their long-standing economics professors, who also created an economic model that we use not only to calculate the baseline, but then the projections on, what would commercialization do, and, how much tax revenue would come into the state or to local governments. And so, as we do in NEPA, right? What do you do with incomplete or unavailable information? Even though we were doing the state law, it kind of has some similar principles. So we did the best we could. We also, by the way, had some data from Colorado, right? Because they had legalized. So we took some of that, we extrapolated, right? Which is also something we're supposed to do in NEPA, right? And we put it together and we did the best we could. I should say that today, which, many years later, the program is having some difficulties. And there's way more illegal activity continuing to go on. And I've read recently some estimates that there's even more than before legalization in terms of folks out on the ground, partly just because of pricing, and that particularly it's very difficult to sell the cannabis in California, but if you're willing to risk transporting out of the state, particularly the states that don't have commercialized legal cannabis, apparently that's really lucrative. So that's a problem they're trying to address. And they created such an onerous, and this is interesting, onerous environmental permitting program for individual projects going through the local government. So we did a programmatic document that kind of covered the big picture. But let's say, you had a 20-acre property and you wanted to legalize a commercial grow operation, you would need to go to your usually a county government, sometimes a city, and then go through the impact review process there in getting a permit. And it turned out that ended up being much more costly than a lot of particularly smaller property owners could afford. And that also led, I think, an unintended consequence, although some predicted it. I know in public meetings, when we were doing the environmental review, that it would lead to kind of the corporatization, that the people that would be able to afford to go through the permitting process would, consolidate, buy up multiple grow operations and properties as a corporation and go that way. So there's also been a lot of talk about equity and commercialization or consolidation as well. So it's still an ongoing both issue and controversy here in California, and I'm sure in some other states doing this as well.
I mean, like you say, equity is everywhere. It's every industry needs equity. There we go. I like that.
It is.
And it's like I say, it's tough to follow that up. But you, Fred Wagner, Pam Hudson, three have run the NEPA case law session for NAEP's annual conference, and it's honestly always a hit. It's one of the most, viewed, watched, listened to panels that we have. And you've also done NEPA training sessions all over the country. And knowing you, there's got to be a good story or two that comes out of doing that kind of work.
Yeah, well, first off, on the conference, I mean, thank you for mentioning Fred and Fred Wagner and Pam Hudson. I'm very honored for them to even let me participate with them because, of course, they're both amazing, masterful attorneys, and I'm not. And so I get to sort of sneak in and I try to disclose that fact every year at the conference, and then also tell people that, I view the court opinions as a practitioner in terms of the lens of, looking for lessons to learn. And not that, attorneys don't do that also. Of course they do. But again, it's a little bit different perspective. And that's what I try to share in the conference. And then when we kind of write it up as well. And it's just been truly amazing to work with them. And for many years, Lucy Swartz, that many folks probably know, was also involved a long time. She worked at the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, also at CEQ. And she's retired now as of several years ago. But she was also just so wonderful to work with. In terms of training, it's been an amazing also experience to just, work with people, federal agency employees, other consultants, and just all sorts of other people as well, with, all sorts of different kinds of projects and agencies and places. And some of the places I've got to travel to, one time with the Navy, I did a workshop down in Key West at the Naval Air Station there. And in addition to being, of course, just an absolutely beautiful place to be, and amazing key lime pie and conch fritters also. And by the way, it reminds me, I actually worked as one winter season as a ranger in South Florida, Biscayne National Park, which is the very northern part of the Florida Key Islands. And I have some other stories sometime. When you have me on for podcast round 2, I'll tell you about my times as a 20-year-old driving confiscated drug cigarette boats through Biscayne Bay with my sunglasses on, pretending I was Don Johnson. And as a 20-year-old, that was a pretty fun thing to do as part of, again, your federal government job. I thought it was the greatest scam in the world. South Florida, this was in, just to date myself, this was in 1991. And it was kind of the wild, wild east, maybe we'll call it. back then. And drug running was not that it maybe isn't now, but it was a crazy place. But so at Key West, back to that for a quick second. So I remember that workshop because we were in this kind of almost like a hangar building right on the edge of the airfield. And I think I can reveal this. I don't think it's classified, but one of the big things they do there is they train American fighter jet pilots to fly against the Soviets, and which this might be a little dated. Maybe they're going to replace it with Chinese plane, but they had MiGs there. I'm not even sure how they got them. And so the other American pilots would fly the MiGs, and they did dogfights using these electronic war game systems where they actually shot each other, but not with, ammunition, live fire, but it was all coordinated, like a giant video game. But what I remember teaching the workshop, other than that was really fascinating and hearing about that, was about every 2 minutes they would take off, and it was a pretty short runway. And so it was so deafeningly loud. And I was actually with Pam Hudson doing that training for the Navy. And whoever was talking, we would just have to stop for like 30 seconds about every 2-3 minutes, because you just could not hear a thing. So that was kind of nutty. And then, another time up in Alaska, which I've been so lucky to both work on projects up there as well as do a lot of NEPA training. One time with the Army, we had somebody in the workshop that said, one day it was like a week-long workshop. They said, hey, let's go over, and I've got a buddy, he'll let us in. The Army Corps of Engineers has this permafrost research tunnel that they had drilled in to the ground. This was north of Fairbanks, Alaska, and it went in really deep and into the ice that was not far under the surface. And they had us wear like these giant, they look like spacesuits, so we wouldn't all freeze to death, and giant moon boots. And we went in, and at one point the guy was like, I want to show you the coolest thing here. And he goes to the wall, which is like all ice, and they would light it up like yellow. And it was just incredible to see it. But he picked up this piece and it had a bug in it. And he's like, we really hope climate change doesn't melt this, because we're really worried that bugs like this might have diseases or viruses from thousands of years ago that we might not have any resistance to. And I'm like, can we get out of the tunnel now? I'm done.
Yeah, I'm done. Yeah.
But that was pretty cool. So, crazy things like that happen, which is pretty nice. But helping, working with agencies, a lot of times, sometimes we would, be at the start of a project and, sit down and really kind of brainstorm. And similar to the work that I do now in my consulting job, my formal job, to do that, it's a lot of fun, and you learn so much. At least I feel like I do, maybe more than they do, which is maybe not fair, but hopefully it's equal, right?
Right. Yeah. And I love that you touched on that, like, having that practitioner's perspective on things. And so, you say we've had Fred on the show a couple of times, and, as he's told us, there's so many wild changes coming before we even have this conference in May. Like, what we say now is going to be different than what will be going on then, which is really, really interesting. So, but to that effect, like, CEQ just released phase 1 of their proposed NEPA rulemaking changes. What insight can you give us from that practitioner's side on this phase 1 and what's coming in the future?
Well, that is both a fabulous question, and maybe it's also that $100,000 question, right? And, from my perspective, in working with so many different agencies, what happened in the previous administration, and of course, the revised regulations that came out after a several-year process and went into effect last September, it just created an enormous amount of confusion. Maybe you might even say chaos. And unfortunately, from my perspective, a lot of just wasted time. Like, I can't even think of the meetings in some of the agencies I had. It was just like, well, what are we supposed to do? Are we supposed to do cumulative impacts or not? We can't figure it out now. And so in my mind, it's a good thing. And, people talk about elections having consequences. And boy, if I didn't understand that before, from the lens of my work, things I think would be obviously in a lot of ways very different if the presidential election had turned out differently. But because it did turn out the way it did, obviously the Biden administration CEQ has a very different view related to a lot of the changes and deletions, really, as well as some of the additions that the Trump administration CEQ made. So the good news is, as you said, now we have what CEQ has announced as phase 1 of their revisions to the regulations. So I guess the revisions to the revisions. As you may know, it's very narrowly targeted. They kind of decided, I guess, the 3 most important things that they wanted to kind of fix in the short term, what they call phase 1. And one of the big things that, of course, is just central to everything we do in impact assessment is restoring those concepts of direct, indirect, and cumulative impacts, and making it very clear, yes, you do need to look at that and analyze those types of impacts. And then also there were some changes made related to applicant focus in relation to purpose and need, and also in how that influenced your range of alternatives. And also a change that had kind of was read as prohibiting agencies in their own regulations from adding essentially requirements. And so in a sense, setting a ceiling on what they could do by saying you can't do anything beyond what the government-wide CEQ regulations say. So that's great and it will be helpful, but there's so many other major changes that I'm sure a lot of people listening know on, major federal action, just huge changes that happen to that definition, to significance, and some changes pretty big for category exclusions and all sorts of other things. So CEQ, has told us, of course, that there's going to be this phase 2 rulemaking that'll be much more comprehensive. And I think what's interesting, there's a lot of rumors is maybe the wrong word, but rumbling expectations, even that given obviously the Biden administration's focus and what the president has said in executive orders and other statements about the focus on equity, we were talking about earlier, and environmental justice, as well as climate change. So I think one really interesting thing to me will not just be maybe restoring some of the essential elements of NEPA that, I think some folks feel was taken out by the changes made by the last administration, but also maybe for the first time, we'll actually have, in addition to guidance on those two topics, which I'm sure we'll have, a revised guidance. We've already been told that, for instance, for climate change, but maybe we'll actually have those topics and maybe even some other priority areas actually go into the regulations, which I think would be fantastic, because if anybody's worked with climate change and NEPA over the last decade or more, I think is kind of maybe about 10, 15 years ago when it first came on the radar, it really hasn't advanced super far. There's a lot of confusion. We had, one administration, the Obama administration spent 6 years coming out with a really great guidance document in 2016. And then President Trump rescinded it, the only CEQ guidance document ever rescinded. And now we have, the new CEQ saying we're going to dust that off and revise that, which will be great as well. But yeah, I think that's a topic. It's obviously just so important, and we'll be hearing all about it in the news, right, this week with the Glasgow Climate Summit that President Biden is traveling to. And yeah, it's hard to conceive that should not be a fundamental part of NEPA in the year 2021 and going forward. So I'm looking forward to, additional guidance and direction from CEQ, and I think a lot of other NEPA practitioners are, and agencies as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I couldn't agree more. And it's going to be such a great, interesting time. I mean, really, we could ask you 100 more questions about it to really test the limits of your brain there. But we're close to time. I did promise that we would at least get to a project of yours. So I want to give you the time to talk through. Is there any project in particular that you have found interesting that you're working on or that you've just completed? It can be in California or anywhere else.
Sure.
Do you have one for us?
Yeah, it's hard. There's a lot of them, as I know there are for most NEPA practitioners. One that comes to mind just because I am working on it right now, but it is an absolutely fascinating project, is being involved on the enormous team that is preparing the NEPA, and because it is here in California, the CEQA reviews as combined documents for the whole California high-speed rail system. And, apparently I've read it's been deemed, the largest infrastructure project, perhaps even in U.S. history, although and maybe single projects. So maybe that's how they get out of it with the interstate highway system, which seemed pretty big too. But either way, but it's enormous, and it goes back for, I think 15 years almost now to a programmatic NEPA document that was done for the whole system. But now I'm on a team where we are doing essentially 8 segments for the whole route, running from, at least the phase 1 routes, running from San Francisco down into the Central Valley and then out over the mountains into Southern California, eventually ending down in the Los Angeles basin area. And it's all divided up into segments that range from 40 miles to 120 or so miles. And some of them just have enormous challenges. These are $10-20 billion cost estimates for many of just each segment, including doing things like building some of the longest tunnels in the world under the San Gabriel Mountains to get from the high desert area in Southern California over to the Burbank and Los Angeles area. And it's kind of a cool thing. I'm on something called the NEPA assignment team that the state of California has, and my company is sort of the contractor for the whole kind of program called the Rail Delivery Partner. So as part of that, the state decided to apply for and get NEPA assignment authority, which a lot of state DOTs for highways have done over the years through a program Congress created now. Gosh, I think it goes back almost a decade ago. But this was the first time any state had been granted this authority from the Federal Railroad Administration, FRA, that had been the NEPA lead agency. So about 2 years ago or so, the state took that over. And so it's kind of really cool is, as a consultant, I almost get to sometimes we joke, we almost play like we're the federal agency, FRA, because our role is really to make sure that the NEPA requirements are being followed, correctly in compliance, even though, the state is sort of in charge. They've taken over that authority. So it's a really interesting role to be in. And I just get to work with some of the top, NEPA and CEQA minds and attorneys, work on the project, some outside counsel, some that work for the state of California, some with the Federal Rail Administration still has some involvement based on the way some of the statute language, they retain authority, for instance, still for like general conformity determinations under the Clean Air Act. So we still work with them as well. And it's just, I can't even, we'd have to take another 6 hours to tell you about all of the, sometimes just crazy issues that come up on a project of that size and magnitude. So it's absolutely fascinating. Sometimes you want to tear your hair out. There's a lot of politics. Some of you may have heard about the whole project and the system, and is it really going to happen? And it's behind schedule and, things like that. But it's just so cool to work on it. So I feel very lucky that I get to do that.
Yeah, and you're totally right. We could ask you so many more questions about it, but honestly, it just means we have to have you back. We have to have you and ask those questions. So which would be so fun for us. And I know we're out of time here. I know Laura and I are so thankful for you to be here because it's really great to learn all these awesome things about you. But before we let you go, is there anything else you would like to talk about? And is there a place where people who want to reach out to you can do so?
Oh, yeah. Thank you for that. Yeah, folks can, I think we're good on, I've told you enough stories, at least for, like you said, round one. By the way, let's do round two on the train. Well, you guys will come out.
There we go. Yeah.
Yes.
A high-speed train.
Yes.
And we'll do it. It'd be awesome.
That would be so cool.
The inaugural ride.
There we go.
Yeah. So to get a hold of me, you can get a hold of me with my work email, which is my name with my middle initial in it, because you're going to, if you don't know, and you may have heard, my name's kind of common. So it's Michael.D, which I won't tell you what that stands for. I'll keep that secretive. But D is in David, which is not my middle name, David, but it's another D name. So michael.d.smith@WSP.com. And always happy to talk with people about NEPA and answer questions. And like you guys, if I don't know the answer, which is often the case or sometimes the case, we got a big network and happy to help people out. And I feel very fortunate. Thank both of you and NAEP for inviting me. Again, it's so nice to have, again, by accident, ended up in this career and, not only working in the field, but also working directly with NAEP and being involved with the board, which has just been a really rewarding experience. So thank you again.
Yeah, awesome. Thank you, Michael. And that's our show. Thank you so much, Michael, for joining us today. It's a lot of fun, a lot of great stories. We're happy to have you back. So as always, everyone, please be sure to check us out each and every Friday. Do not forget to subscribe, rate, and review. See you, everyone.